I'm shooting this video on March 30th, 2021. It's kind of an important day for me. You see, I paroled from Chowchilla State Prison in Chowchilla, California on March 30th, 2018. 3 years ago today. I remember getting onto the little prison transport van that would drive me past the wall, past the electric fences, and deposit me in the parking lot as a free man. And thinking to myself that this was the last thing I was going to have to do as an inmate. The last time a correctional officer was going to tell me, "Inmate channel, get in the van!" And I was going to do it, and then it would be, "Aaron, free man, get out of the van." They drove me out into the parking lot where my wife and my mother and my two sons, aged 2 and 5, were waiting for me. You see, I have 2 children who were born while I was incarcerated because I was eligible for the family visiting program, which they have in California, where inmates are able to be with their family overnight. My mother and my wife were so excited to see me, and my children were laughing, and it was this wonderful moment. And all I wanted to do was leap into the passenger seat of the car and tell them, "Go, go, go, hit the gas, get us out of here before they change their mind." I know that it seems absurd, and you might even think that I'm joking, but I was just panicked to put miles between myself and that prison. I think it's that I'd spent so many years telling myself that once I got out, I was going to do everything right and not risk going back, that when I was finally confronted with the reality of being a free man, it was a little panicking. I wanted to be moving to put some distance between myself and the prison. Believe it or not, I actually ran into a situation the first day that I was out of prison that could realistically have landed me right back behind bars. You see, we had a ways to drive. We had to go back to Mendocino County. That's my county of commitment where I had to touch base with parole. I was coming from Chowchilla, which is in central California. That's a lengthy drive. And I asked my mother if we could stop at a park. I'd like to see some trees, some grass, some fresh air. I think these are pretty reasonable things to want to experience after so many years of concrete and steel and the stink of thousands of men all locked in a little area together. So, since we didn't know the area, my mother just got on the GPS and asked where there was a park, and the magic lady who lives inside of the box in the GPS told us that if we took a couple of lefts and drove for a little while, there was a city park. If we'd been locals, I think we would have known to avoid this park, but because we were just passing through, we didn't think it was a big deal that whenever we sat down at the picnic benches with my wife and my mother and my 2 boys, that there was a very disheveled, presumably homeless man who started approaching us. But I did look up. You have that hypervigilance that you get in prison, and it was just ringing alarm bells. I tried to ignore it. This was the free world. I didn't need to always be on point, always be paying attention to what was around me. But this guy wasn't just run-of-the-mill garden variety impoverished person. He was obviously a little mentally disturbed. And as he slowly started sidling up towards us, just like at the periphery of our table, it became clear that he wasn't in his right mind. He was muttering loudly to himself. I heard a couple of F-bombs, and he wasn't really talking to us, he was talking to himself very angrily. I asked my wife, "Hey honey, why don't you take the keys and go unlock the door to the car and take the baby with you, and my mom and I'll gather up this stuff and we'll take the 6-year-old and we'll be right behind you." Once we started gathering up our stuff, I guess that was the cue for this guy to ramp up the crazy. He started actually actively cursing at myself, my mother, and my 6-year-old. Again, F-bombs, some racial epithets. It was nasty stuff. So we started fast walking to the car. It wasn't too far, and we figured we'd just get out of there. He started fast walking behind us. And I actually started running with my mother and my 6-year-old in my arms to just get to that car as quick as we could. I told my mom, "Come on, let's just get out of here. I can't have any problems today. They'll send me right back if I get in any kind of problem on the day I parole." It's a funny thing because I had to change the way that I addressed problems. Look, if you're in prison and somebody starts running at you, yelling curse words, you're way justified to punch him in the nose and bloody it up for him. That's to be expected. In fact, if you don't do it, you're labeling yourself a coward and a victim for anybody else. Out here in the real world, that is not an appropriate response, and I had to really bear it in mind that if I went and punched this guy in the face because he was yelling things at my mother and I'd be in the wrong, and I would absolutely go to jail and prison for it. It's a different set of rules, and I had to adapt quickly. It got pretty bad once we reached the car. As I recall, the thing that stands out to me the moment was whenever he yelled 3 times rapidly, "Rape you to death! Rape you to death! Rape you to death!" as we were trying to pile into the car. And I guess that us reaching the car told him that we'd reached a safe zone, essentially, that he'd asserted his territory, chased us out of the park, and he didn't push any further on us. I want to be clear, this guy wasn't actually physically intimidating. It's not that we were scared he would actually hurt us. He was in his late 50s, I'd say, and obviously in very poor physical health. He probably could have used a couple of days of sleep and food and not having to live under a picnic table or wherever the poor man had to live. I'm not trying to speak ill of him. I'm sure his life was very hard up to this point. But we just got out of there as fast as we could, and thankfully so, because the last thing I wanted to have to do was be in a holding cell explaining to the other guy how, I was protecting my family and I beat up some old man, and by prison standards, I would have gotten a pat on the back. You're protecting your family. You do what you gotta. A man does what he's gotta do. But you can't take prison rules and try and apply them in a real world situation. In fact, what would have happened is that I would have assaulted an elderly, mentally infirm person just because I didn't like the way that he was acting. He didn't actually put a hand on my family or I, he just scared us, frankly. There was one other event that I've talked about just a little bit on the day that I paroled that I'd like to touch on. We had to drive through the Bay Area, San Francisco. San Francisco is where San Quentin is, the state prison that was built all the way 150 years ago. It's where I served the first month and a half that I was incarcerated in the state system. We drove right past it, some of the same roads, the same landmarks that I'd seen whenever I'd been transported to San Quentin 17 years before. Wow. It was incredible. I still think about driving over the bridge and looking and seeing the prison with all of the razor wire and the concrete walls and thinking I'd been on the other side of that. And not just the other side of the walls and the fences, but the other side of the 17 years that I had grown and lived in this terrible system. I asked my mother to play The Boys Are Back in Town, a song by Thin Lizzie that had personal resonance for me. You see, I'd listened to the song 17 years prior on the way to San Quentin and promised myself that whatever it took, I was going to survive my prison term. As I listened to it 17 years later, I reflected on how much richer my life was for the time I'd spent in prison. My wife and I, our relationship was stronger than it had ever been. And I had my boys, who to this day are the most wonderful thing in my life. They're my treasures, and they make every day worthwhile. Take a moment. Consider the people in your life who, after a 17-year prison term, or heck, a 2-week vacation, you'd be excited to see. The people who you would realize make your day-to-day life worthwhile. Make sure that they know how important they are to you, because the day that we take these people for granted is the day that we start to lose them. And nobody should have to endure a life in which they've lost the people who are so important to them.